Joining us now is the Chief Executive Officer of Crownia Holdings, LTD, and a couple of interesting transactions going on. And Herick, good to have you with us.
Good morning.
Now, there's a major transaction that you guys are involved in. That's why I got you on today. Can you just, rather than me doing the introduction, can you just kind of outline for our audience what went down, how you're involved in it?
Yes, fix right. Yeah, Crownia is a company engaged in the business of trading specialty steel products. We buy from the Chinese manufacturers and we sell to our customers who are all outside of China. So this is our major business.
Okay, so Trump was elected president. One of the things that he said, Herick, during his campaign, is that he was going to stop allowing the Chinese to basically dump steel in the U.S. Okay, so they produce steel in China. The government subsidizes the cost of production, which allows then the Chinese to dump it into the United States and sell it much cheaper than manufacturers can buy United States steel, all right, because they're paying higher labor costs and there's no government subsidy. Is this practice going to continue on, and how is your company involved in that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that we need to look at. Number one is that this is no doubt have a negative impact on the steel industry in China. But on the other hand, we also need to look at what is the current supply situation in China in terms of the steel. The Chinese government have been trimming down the excess inventory in the country during the last 2 years, and right now in China, in the country, the excess inventory is actually get back to a very reasonable level. In fact, it's lower than a normal situation. That's number one. Number two, also on the supply side of steel in the country, the whole industry, the whole steel industry in the country is actually going through a restructuring. Many major steel manufacturers are going through a merger transaction. For example, we all know that it's like a major steel manufacturer, Wuhan Steel, and another one, Bao Steel. They are going through a merger restructuring. Now, this kind of restructuring merger transaction, unlike in the Western world, they are all driven by the government. And in this particular case, the two major steel manufacturers going through this restructuring, there will be a lot of integration challenges that the new management needs to face. So I would say going forward for the next 12 to 18 months, the production of steel in China will be trimming down. So there won't be like too low price steel coming out from the country. Second thing, in terms of all the anti-dumping of steel in the Western world, including in the North America, in EU, there have been a lot of talks about that. The countries are actually imposing the high tax rate on those steel products. That is going to hurt the Chinese steel manufacturers. But we also need to look at one thing here is, from the Chinese exporter perspective, the EU countries and the American together actually only represent less than 8% of the total export. In fact, the country, China, is actually dealing more with the emerging countries, emerging markets. For example, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all those countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Middle East. So I would say from the media perspective, it's a big negative impact, but in the practical producing and export business, the impact is limited.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that the European nations and the U.S. only accounts for 8% consumption of the steel that the Chinese government is exporting out of China, that the other 92% is being purchased by emerging economies outside of the traditional West. That's number one that I've heard. I've also heard you say that the Chinese government has merged two of your bigger companies and that the excess supply, which has swelled your inventories, which has then allowed the Chinese government to quote unquote dump steel in the U.S. under normal competitive pricing because it's subsidized. You're saying that's going to end not because of a policy that Trump has. It's going to end because the excess inventory is going away. Is that what I've heard?
Yes, correct. And let me add one more point here is that the excess inventory is going away. Okay, the Chinese steel manufacturers are going through restructuring, and therefore the production is coming down. And because the production is coming down, the steel will not be as cheap as before, and therefore the anti-dumping or the dumping of steel to the outside world, the situation will not be as severe as previous years.
Okay, so that's the steel industry. Now, the Chinese government has also been dumping cheap aluminum on the U.S. So what happens is the Chinese exports the aluminum or the steel over. It's under the cost of U.S. production. U.S. companies that need the aluminum or steel, they buy it because they're saving money. I mean, they're in business to make money for their shareholders or for their owners, depending on how big they are. But then it puts American aluminum companies, manufacturing companies, or steel companies out of business because there's no tariff. Trump has said, I'm going to stop that. I'm just going to tariff it. So you're going to have to pay 25% to get in the Los Angeles dock. How is the Chinese government going to deal with these new tariffs that are likely to get installed by Congress in a Trump administration?
I'm not an expert in the aluminum, but my understanding will be this, is that the government in the last 18 months have been implementing a strategy or a policy, and what we call is reducing the energy consumption and reducing the environmental pollution impact. Because of that, a lot of these big industries like steel manufacturing, like aluminum or coal or all the other major industry will have a major impact in the domestic market in China already. So I have to say that it's like the Trump government, even they increase the tariff, the Chinese government, they have their own internal issue that they need to deal with. So as I said, I would guess it will be more or less the same as the steel industry, the aluminum, the dumping over to outside world. The situation will not be as serious as before.
All right, so you're pretty confident that things are going to change. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know you're an expert on steel, but I'm going to get your take on this, Mr. Lau, because obviously in your position as CEO for Crownia, you know what's going on. The Chinese economy is growing by 7%, right, about 7% annually. The U.S. economy, by contrast, is growing at 1%. I think India's second. They're at 6%. How is the Chinese economy able to maintain that level of economic growth and what has been kind of a worldwide downturn for everybody else?
I would say that's my understanding about the Chinese economy.
Right.
The economy in China actually is facing serious problems. Okay, the so-called 6.7% GDP growth year over year, I would say a large part of it actually coming from the government expenditure. In particular, in terms of the government's investment in infrastructure, all that kind of like a major government spending. The actual domestic consumption is not as big as before. Second thing, the real estate market is actually facing a very tough environment. It's been well known to the Western world that in many second-tier and third-tier cities in the country, they have a lot of empty apartments over there, empty condos over there, but they still keep building it. So yes, we might see the 6.7% GDP growth in the last couple of years, and even this year, the country cannot maintain this kind of growth. It has to come down. Second thing, if people look at the monetary policy of China, if you look at the statistics from the the central bank in China, the M2, the money supply, is keep going up every single year and surpass the America. So I would say the country is actually facing a huge problem. The GDP growth could be somehow a big portion coming from the expansionary monetary policy of the country.
Fascinating. That is a fabulous update, Mr. Lau. We're out of time for this segment. I really appreciate your insight. Herick Lau, I want to thank you for your time. You're quite knowledgeable, and that was quite an enlightening dialogue. Thank you, sir, so much.